Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Park Path.
I was out for my usual morning run at Riverside Park, a quiet escape from the city's relentless chaos. It was an unusually cold morning, the kind where your breath hangs in the air like ghostly vapors. The park was still and silent, save for the crunch of gravel under my sneakers and the distant rustle of the trees. As I rounded the bend near the old oak tree, something caught my eye. Nestled in the grass was a smartphone, partially buried beneath a few fallen leaves. I slowed my pace and squatted down to inspect it. It looked expensive, the kind of phone that seemed out of place here in the park, forgotten and alone. I picked it up gingerly, noting the cracked screen and the smudges of dirt that marred its sleek surface. My curiosity got the better of me. I pressed the power button and watched as the screen flickered to life. Instead of the usual home screen, I was greeted by a lock screen that displayed a photo of a woman. Her eyes were vacant, almost hollow, and there was something profoundly unsettling about the way she stared out from the screen. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that the phone had been waiting here for me, or that something was terribly wrong. Back home, I set the phone on my kitchen counter and decided to try and return it to its rightful owner. I plugged it into my computer to see if I could find any contact information that would lead me to the person. As I sifted through the apps and files, I was struck by how empty the phone seemed. No recent calls, no text messages, just a void. Then I stumbled upon something strange, a folder labeled Videos. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I tapped on the folder and found several video files, all dated within the past few weeks. The first video was a shaky recording of what looked like a bedroom. The footage was dark and grainy, and it took me a moment to make out the surroundings. The camera panned erratically, capturing glimpses of an unmade bed, a cluttered nightstand, and a window with the blinds drawn. But it was the figure pacing back and forth in the dim light that held my attention. There was no sound, just the faint hum of the camera's motor and the unsettling image of the figure's restless movements. I tried to make out any details, but the darkness and the jittery camera work made it nearly impossible. I felt a growing sense of unease as I watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Who was this person? Why were these videos here? And where was the owner of this phone? I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me as I continued to explore the phone's gallery. I scrolled through the remaining videos, each one more disturbing than the last. One video showed a masked figure standing motionless in front of a house. The figure was obscured by shadows, but the way they stood there, unmoving and silent, made my skin crawl. Another video captured an eerily still room. The camera focused on an overturned chair as if something had been abruptly disturbed. The timestamp on the video showed it had been recorded only days before I found the phone. Each video left me with a growing sense of unease. I couldn't help but wonder about the stories behind them. Who were these people? Why were they being filmed? Desperate for answers, I took to the internet. I searched news articles and social media posts, hoping to find some clue about the phone's owner. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a news article about a woman who had been reported missing in the area where I had found the phone. Her name was Emily Parker. The photo accompanying the article was unmistakable. It was the same woman from the lock screen of the phone. My heart raced as I read the details of her disappearance. Emily had been missing for several weeks. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The phone I had found might belong to someone who was not only missing but potentially in grave danger. Determined to uncover more about the disturbing videos, I decided to visit the address I had found in one of them. The location was in a secluded part of town, away from the hustle and bustle. As I drove through the winding streets, an unsettling feeling grew stronger with each passing block. When I finally arrived, my heart sank. The house was an old Victorian, its grandeur long faded. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was a tangle of overgrown weeds and brambles. The sight alone made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me from the shadows. I approached the house cautiously, my footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges echoing through the empty halls. The interior was just as unsettling as the outside. The rooms were eerily quiet, and the air felt heavy, as if it were thick with unspoken fears. I wandered through the house, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and found several rooms that matched the scenes from the videos. An overturned chair here, a cluttered nightstand there. It felt like stepping into a nightmarish version of reality. My search led me to the basement. As I descended the creaky stairs, a sense of foreboding gripped me. The basement was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but something caught my eye. A wooden trunk sat in the corner, dust-covered and locked. I managed to pry it open with some effort, revealing a collection of old photographs and papers. The photographs were of Emily Parker, her face captured in various settings, at home, in the park, on the street. Alongside them were disturbing notes detailing her daily routine, her habits, and even personal details like her favorite coffee shop and her work schedule. It was clear that someone had been obsessively tracking her every move. The chilling realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Someone had been watching Emily, documenting her life with a disturbing level of detail. I shuddered as I pieced together the horrifying truth. The videos were not just recordings, they were evidence of a twisted obsession. And I had stumbled right into the middle of it. As I left the house, the cold wind seemed to bite at my skin, intensifying my sense of dread. My footsteps echoed in the quiet street, and I glanced over my shoulder to see a figure standing across the street, motionless and shrouded in shadow. My heart pounded in my chest, and I broke into a sprint, desperate to get back to the safety of my apartment. Once inside, I tried to call the police, but my calls went unanswered. Panic was setting in as I realized I was on my own. My mind raced, replaying the unsettling discoveries from the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, a chilling news update greeted me. Emily Parker's body had been found in a different part of the city. The report was brief, mentioning only that the police were investigating. There was no mention of the videos or the house I had visited. It was as if the truth I had uncovered was being deliberately kept from the public. My stomach churned with a gnawing anxiety as I returned to the phone, hoping it might offer some explanation. I watched the final video, and what I saw nearly made me drop the device. The video was dark and grainy, but the figure from the street was unmistakable. The same shadowy presence stood in front of the camera, holding the very phone I had found. The figure held the phone up, pointing the camera directly at the lens as if addressing me personally. I saw the glint of the phone's screen reflecting back at me. The message was clear and terrifying: "You're next." I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The realization hit me like a wave. I had unknowingly become part of this nightmare. The figure was not just observing, but had made me a part of their twisted game. My sense of security shattered, leaving me with an overwhelming fear of what might come next.
The Secret Project.
I'm part of a group of friends who have taken on the challenge of restoring an old school building in our city. The place is known for its rich history and eerie reputation, and despite our excitement, we're all a little on edge about what we might find. We'd heard the rumors about strange occurrences and a dark past, but we were determined to bring this old building back to life. When we first stepped inside, the building seemed to welcome us with its dusty old charm. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and forgotten memories. We were greeted by a maze of long corridors and dimly lit classrooms, each room filled with remnants of the past. Dust-covered desks, faded chalkboards, and old, tattered curtains. It was as if the building itself had been waiting for us to uncover its secrets. Our enthusiasm was palpable as we started the work. We began by clearing out the old furniture and peeling away layers of wallpaper that had yellowed with age. It was during this process that we stumbled upon the first oddities. Strange markings had been etched into the walls, symbols and patterns that seemed out of place in a school. At first, we dismissed them as old graffiti or remnants of some previous renovation project. They were cryptic and didn't make much sense, but we chalked them up to the quirks of an old building. As the days went by, these markings became more frequent and increasingly bizarre. The symbols grew more intricate, and we found ourselves questioning whether these were mere coincidences or something more sinister. But with our determination to restore the building, we pressed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that came with each discovery. As our restoration project continued, the strange markings on the walls became even more frequent. It was as if they were guiding us deeper into the building's secrets. While we were removing a particularly stubborn piece of paneling, we discovered a hidden compartment in the wall. Inside, we found old files, strange pieces of equipment, and what appeared to be medical instruments. They were completely out of place for a school, and their presence made us uneasy. The files were filled with handwritten notes and faded photographs, alluding to something much darker than we had anticipated. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to dig deeper into the building's history. It wasn't long before we uncovered a disturbing fact. The building had been used in the 1950s for experimental research involving psychological and medical experiments. The documents we found detailed a series of unethical practices conducted under the guise of scientific advancement. They spoke of experiments that went horribly wrong, leading to the suffering of those involved. The more we learned, the more unsettled we became. The historical records revealed that the experiments had been kept secret, and the building had been abandoned abruptly once the research was deemed too controversial. It was as if the entire chapter had been erased from history. Despite our growing unease, we pressed on with the restoration. We were driven by a mix of curiosity and determination to see this project through. But as we worked, strange things started happening. The lights flickered unpredictably, cold spots appeared without warning, and odd noises echoed through the empty halls. There were moments when it felt as though we were being watched, a sensation that made it hard to shake off the feeling of dread. The more we uncovered, the more intense the atmosphere became. We began to question whether the building was simply haunted by its past or if something more sinister was at play. The disturbances in the building escalated quickly. At first, it was small things, tools moving from one place to another, lights flickering erratically, and a growing feeling of unease. But soon, the occurrences became more alarming. We would see eerie figures darting out of the corner of our eyes, only to find nothing when we turned our heads. The whispers began, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Footsteps echoed through the empty halls, even though we knew we were alone. One particularly chilling night, as we worked late into the evening, the whispers grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps that seemed to follow us wherever we went. Our group's fear began to fracture us. Some members insisted that the building was haunted, their faces pale with terror as they recounted their experiences. Others, trying to cling to reason, attempted to rationalize the events, attributing them to old wiring or drafts in the building. The tension within the group was palpable, mirroring the growing malevolence that seemed to seep from the walls. The building was no longer just an old structure. It felt alive, as though it had an agenda of its own. Things came to a head when one of our members, Jake, decided to explore a previously unnoticed basement area. It was a hidden space we had only discovered recently, and Jake was determined to uncover its secrets. As he descended into the basement, we heard him let out a startled shout, followed by silence. When we reached him, Jake was standing in a corner, staring at something we couldn't see. His face was ashen, his eyes wide with a terror we had never seen before. Jake recounted his encounter in a trembling voice. He had seen a shadowy figure in the dim light, a shape that seemed to loom over him with a palpable sense of dread. The figure didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, and Jake felt as though it was suffocating him with its malevolence. The experience left him shaken and desperate to leave the building. We tried to calm him, but his reaction was a stark reminder of the danger we were dealing with. Jake's trauma was evident, and he insisted that we abandon the project immediately. It was clear that whatever was in the building was not just a figment of our imagination, it was very real and very dangerous. Driven by a mix of fear and resolve, we decided to dig deeper into the remaining files, hoping to piece together the full story behind the building's sinister past. What we uncovered was even more horrifying than we had imagined. The documents revealed that the experiments conducted in the 1950s were not just unethical, they were depraved. The researchers were obsessed with creating a means to control and manipulate human emotions, pushing the boundaries of morality and sanity. They conducted inhumane experiments designed to instill and exploit fear, seeking to understand how to dominate the human psyche. The more we read, the clearer it became that the building had been a testing ground for these dark endeavors. The notes described twisted methods of psychological torment and physical suffering, and it seemed that the researchers had not only studied their subjects but had also become part of their experiments. The files hinted at a final, failed experiment, one that was meant to bind the entities created by their research to the building itself. As we connected the dots, a chilling realization dawned upon us. The building wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for something far more malevolent. The residual entity that now tormented us was likely a byproduct of those experiments, feeding off the fear and dread that had been instilled in it over decades. It seemed to be tied to our own experiences, growing stronger and more vicious as we unearthed the truth. Desperate to end the nightmare, we decided to confront the entity directly. We hoped that by facing it, we could somehow banish it or at least understand its motives. That night, we gathered in the heart of the building, where the disturbances seemed strongest. Armed with our knowledge and a few protective rituals we'd read about, we prepared for what we hoped would be a decisive confrontation. But instead of finding resolution, we were met with a surge of terror unlike anything we had experienced before. The entity retaliated with a fury that seemed to tap into our deepest fears and insecurities. Shadows twisted into nightmarish shapes, and the whispers grew into a cacophony of agonized voices. The walls seemed to close in on us, and every personal fear we had was brought to the forefront. The confrontation turned into a desperate battle for our sanity. Each of us was targeted in a way that felt intensely personal, as though the entity was using our own fears against us. The building, once a relic of the past, had become a living nightmare, a place where the lines between reality and horror were blurred beyond recognition. The building had become a battleground of psychological terror. Every corner seemed to pulsate with an oppressive energy, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. We were trapped in a nightmarish loop, where the entity's attacks became more intense and our sanity was pushed to the brink. In the final showdown, we gathered in the central hall, the epicenter of the building's malevolent presence. The air was thick with fear, and the temperature dropped to an icy chill that seeped into our bones. Shadows danced and twisted around us, and the whispers grew into a deafening roar of tormenting voices. We had to confront both the entity and our deepest fears. As we braced ourselves for the confrontation, the building seemed to come alive with a malevolent force. Each of us faced a personal nightmare, a manifestation of our most profound anxieties. It was as if the entity had learned all our vulnerabilities and was using them to break us down. The experience was overwhelming, pushing us to the edge of our endurance. Realizing we had no other viable options, we made the painful decision to abandon the project. The thought of leaving the building felt like a defeat, but the alternative, staying and facing the relentless terror, was even more unbearable. With heavy hearts and a deep sense of dread, we packed up our things and left the building behind. As we walked away, the weight of our experiences lingered. We knew that the entity and the dark history of the building would remain unresolved, a sinister presence waiting in the shadows for the next unwitting souls to uncover its horrors. The knowledge that we had left something so evil behind, with no closure or resolution, haunted us deeply. Moving on with our lives, we tried to forget the nightmares that had become a part of us. But the scars of our ordeal remained, etched into our minds and souls. The building stood as a grim reminder of the horrors we had faced, its secrets buried but still waiting to be unearthed by those who dared to cross its threshold.
The basement light.
Moving into the old Victorian house felt like the start of a dream for Jack and me. We'd spent months searching for the perfect place, and when we found this charming, slightly worn-down home in a quiet town outside Boston, it felt like destiny. The house had character, beautiful woodwork, high ceilings, and a certain timeless elegance that drew us in immediately. As we carried the last of our boxes inside, I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement mixed with a hint of apprehension. This was our new beginning. The first few hours were a whirlwind of unpacking, arranging furniture, and marveling at the details of our new home. Every room held something unique, an old fireplace with intricate carvings, stained glass windows that cast colorful patterns on the floor, and a creaky wooden staircase that led to a spacious attic. The place was everything we'd hoped for, and more. As the day turned into evening, we decided to explore the basement, which we hadn't fully checked out during our initial visits. Jack grabbed a flashlight, and we carefully descended the narrow stairs, the air growing cooler and mustier with each step. The basement was vast, with stone walls and low ceilings that made the space feel almost like a hidden dungeon. We wandered around, shining the light into corners and brushing away cobwebs. That's when we noticed it, a door at the far end of the basement, barely visible in the dim light. It was old and weathered, the paint peeling off in flakes. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Locked. There was no key in sight, and no obvious place where one might be hidden. I looked at Jack, a mix of curiosity and unease bubbling up inside me. Maybe it's just storage, Jack suggested, but I could tell he was as intrigued as I was. We didn't dwell on it too long, though. We had plenty of other things to worry about, like finding where I'd packed the coffee maker. That night, after we'd finally settled in and were preparing for bed, I noticed something strange. The basement light, which we'd turned off earlier, seemed to be flickering. It cast a faint, erratic glow through the narrow gap under the basement door. I mentioned it to Jack, but he just shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an old bulb or a loose wire. I agreed, but a small knot of unease formed in the pit of my stomach. As we climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the image of that locked door from my mind. What was behind it? And why was the light flickering now, after being perfectly fine all day? I tried to push the thoughts away, telling myself we'd figure it out in the morning. But as I drifted off to sleep, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Something wasn't right with this house. I could feel it in my bones. The days that followed were a blur of unpacking, decorating, and trying to settle into our new life. But despite the excitement of setting up our dream home, there was an undercurrent of unease that neither Jack nor I could ignore. The basement light, which had flickered that first night, began to act up more frequently. At first, it was just an occasional flicker, a brief stutter that we could easily explain away. But as time went on, it became more persistent, almost rhythmic, like the pulse of the house itself. Each time the light flickered, something strange would happen. It started small, objects would be slightly out of place, a book moved from one side of the table to the other, or a chair nudged just a bit from where we'd left it. At first, we laughed it off, blaming it on our own forgetfulness or the possibility of a draft. But as the days passed, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One evening, as I was making dinner, I heard a faint noise behind me. It was so soft that I almost missed it, like the rustling of fabric or a distant whisper. I turned around, expecting to see Jack, but the kitchen was empty. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end as I strained to hear, but the sound had vanished. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just the house settling, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Later that night, as we were watching TV in the living room, we heard footsteps above us. Heavy, deliberate steps, moving slowly across the floor. Jack muted the TV, and we both sat in silence, staring up at the ceiling. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the room to the other, then stopped abruptly. We exchanged worried glances, neither of us wanting to say what we were both thinking. "Did you hear that?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, but there's no one up there, right?" We both knew the answer. We hadn't been upstairs since we came down after dinner, and the only other way into the house was the front door, which had been locked all night. Still, Jack got up and grabbed the flashlight. "I'll go check," he said, his voice steadier than I felt. I followed him upstairs, every creak of the floorboards making my heart race. But when we reached the top, everything was just as we'd left it. No signs of anyone or anything out of place. But as we stood there in the darkened hallway, the basement light flickered again, casting an eerie glow up the stairs. "We need to figure out what's behind that door," Jack said, his voice tense. "This is getting out of hand." I nodded, relieved that he felt the same way. The curiosity about that locked room had been gnawing at both of us, and now it felt like we had no choice but to find out what was inside. We decided to hire a locksmith, hoping that whatever was behind that door would provide some answers. The next morning, we made the call. The locksmith arrived later that day, an older man with a friendly demeanor that put us at ease. He didn't seem fazed by our request, just nodded and got to work. As he tinkered with the lock, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation mixed with dread. What if we found something terrible behind that door? Or worse, what if we found nothing at all? Finally, with a soft click, the lock gave way. The locksmith stepped back, motioning for us to go ahead. Jack reached for the door handle, and as he turned it, the basement light flickered one last time before plunging us into darkness. The locksmith worked quickly, his hand steady as he manipulated the tools to unlock the door. Jack and I stood behind him, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that once this door opened, there would be no going back. With a soft click, the lock finally gave way. The locksmith stepped back, nodding to us. "There you go," he said with a faint smile. "All set." Jack exchanged a quick glance with me before reaching for the doorknob. I held my breath as he turned it and slowly pushed the door open, revealing a dark, musty room beyond. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Stale air mixed with something earthy, like old wood and dust. We stepped inside, and as our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we began to take in the room's strange details. The walls were covered in peculiar symbols, carved deep into the wood. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, jagged lines and swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. In the center of the room was a broken light fixture, its wires hanging loose, swaying slightly as if disturbed by a breeze. It was obvious that this was the source of the flickering light that had been haunting us. The bulb, shattered and blackened, lay in pieces on the floor beneath it. "This place is creepy," Jack muttered, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. He moved toward the light fixture, examining it closely. "No wonder the light's been acting up. This thing is ancient." While Jack inspected the light, my attention was drawn to a small, dust-covered table against the far wall. On it sat an old leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn with age. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, a strange compulsion driving me to open it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with cryptic writings that made little sense to me. The handwriting was erratic, as if the writer had been in a frenzy, desperate to get their thoughts down. As I flipped through the pages, I found disturbing drawings, twisted, shadowy figures with hollow eyes, strange rituals depicted in graphic detail, and symbols that matched the ones carved into the walls. This is insane," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Whoever lived here before us, they were into something dark." Jack came over, peering over my shoulder at the journal. His face paled as he took in the disturbing contents. "What the hell were they doing down here?" he muttered, flipping back through the pages with a grim expression. We spent the next hour poring over the journal, trying to make sense of the chaotic writings. The more we read, the more uneasy we became. It seemed the previous owner had been involved in some kind of supernatural practices, experimenting with rituals meant to summon something. The writings were filled with references to the other side and breaking the barrier, but what chilled me to the bone were the warnings scribbled in the margins, desperate pleas to stop, to turn back before it was too late. "This is bad, Emily," Jack said, closing the journal with a finality that made my stomach drop. "I don't know what they were messing with, but it's nothing good. We should have this place blessed or something." I nodded, too shaken to argue. We decided to leave the room and lock it back up, but as we turned to leave, the basement light flickered once more before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. The next few hours were a blur. We managed to find our way back upstairs and call an electrician to fix the light, but the unease lingered. That night, as we lay in bed, the strange occurrences in the house intensified. We heard whispers again, louder this time, almost as if they were coming from inside the walls. Footsteps echoed through the halls, and doors creaked open and shut on their own. The air felt heavy, charged with something we couldn't see but could definitely feel. Lying there in the darkness, clutching Jack's hand for comfort, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had unleashed something by opening that door. Something that had been waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. After that night, everything changed. The house, once a place of excitement and possibility, had become a living nightmare. With the basement light now completely out, the shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching across every corner of our home. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. At first, it was just small things, objects moving on their own, subtle shifts in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. But soon, the activity became impossible to ignore. One morning, I walked into the kitchen to find every cabinet door wide open, the contents of each one strewn across the floor. Plates shattered, glasses broken, and food scattered everywhere, as if someone, or something, had gone through them in a fit of rage. Jack and I were at our wits' end. We tried to stay calm, to rationalize what was happening, but the terror was starting to take its toll. Every night, as we lay in bed, we heard voices, soft at first, whispering our names, but growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. It was as if the house was alive, taunting us, playing with our fear. The shadowy figures were the worst. At first, they were just flickers in the corners of our vision, dark shapes that disappeared the moment we turned to look at them. But soon, they became more tangible, more real. I remember one night, I was in the living room when I saw it, a tall, dark figure standing in the doorway, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, as it slowly turned its head to look at me. There were no eyes, just darkness, but I could feel its gaze, cold and menacing. I screamed, and Jack came running, but by the time he reached me, the figure was gone. He held me as I sobbed, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. We were both trapped, prisoners in our own home, with no idea how to escape. Things only got worse from there. We tried to leave, desperate to get out of the house and never look back, but it was as if the house had other plans. Every door we tried was locked, every window sealed shut. Jack tried to force the front door open, but it wouldn't budge, as if something on the other side was holding it closed. We were trapped, and the realization hit us like a ton of bricks. Whatever had been locked away in that basement room was now free, and it wasn't going to let us go. That night was the worst. We could feel the presence growing stronger, filling every room with a cold, oppressive energy. The voices were louder now, almost deafening, and the shadows moved with purpose, closing in on us. At one point, the lights in the entire house flickered, then went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside, casting eerie, fleeting shadows across the walls. We huddled together in the living room, holding on to each other for dear life, as the house seemed to come alive around us. Objects flew across the room, smashing against the walls with violent force. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds, whispers, footsteps, the creak of floorboards, and the distant, eerie wail of something that didn't belong in this world. Jack tried to calm me down, whispering that we'd find a way out, but I could hear the desperation in his voice. We were both scared out of our minds, and the sense of hopelessness was overwhelming. It felt like we were being hunted, like the house itself was determined to drive us mad. And then, just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, the voices stopped. The silence was sudden, jarring, and for a moment, we dared to hope that it was over. But that hope was short-lived. From the basement, we heard a loud, heavy thud, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. Whatever was down there, it was coming for us. We bolted for the door, Jack throwing his weight against it with everything he had. But it wouldn't give. It was like the house had sealed itself shut, trapping us inside with whatever we had unleashed. Panic set in, and we started banging on the walls, screaming for help, but no one came. We were alone, at the mercy of a force we couldn't understand and had no way to fight. And as the footsteps grew closer, echoing through the house like a death knell, we knew we were running out of time. Whatever had been locked away in that room was free now, and it wanted us. The basement was darker than I'd ever seen it. Jack and I stood at the top of the stairs, our breaths coming in shallow, terrified gasps. The oppressive silence that filled the house felt like a heavy shroud, pressing down on us, making it almost impossible to think clearly. But we had no choice. We had to confront this thing, whatever it was. We clutched the journal tightly, the pages still warm from the frantic reading we'd done. The last few pages had been a revelation. The journal had detailed the rituals and protections the previous owner had put in place, including the crucial role of the basement light. According to the writings, the light wasn't just an ordinary fixture. It was a barrier, a safeguard that kept the entity contained within the confines of that room. Without it, the entity was free to unleash its fury. We descended the stairs, each step echoing ominously in the stillness. The basement felt colder, the air thicker, as if it was resisting our intrusion. I flicked on the flashlight we'd brought, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the grotesque symbols on the walls. The sight of them still sent shivers down my spine, but we had to focus. We needed to restore the light. The broken fixture was lying on the floor in the middle of the room, its shattered glass scattered around it. Jack and I knelt beside it, our hands shaking as we tried to reassemble it. The urgency of our task was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity as the temperature in the basement dropped further, and the once silent house now seemed to vibrate with a low, menacing hum. I glanced nervously at Jack, who was wrestling with the wires, his face illuminated by the harsh beam of our flashlight. "Hurry," I whispered, almost afraid to make any noise that might provoke whatever was lurking in the shadows. "We need to get this fixed before it's too late." As we worked, the sense of dread intensified. The shadows around us seemed to grow darker, more animated. I could feel a malevolent presence encroaching on our space, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. The whispers started again, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. They were filled with anger and hatred, their echoes bouncing off the walls, growing more insistent. Finally, with a loud click, Jack managed to reattach the fixture. I rushed to flip the switch, my heart pounding in my chest. The light flickered weakly before stabilizing, casting a dim glow over the room. For a moment, it seemed like we had succeeded. The oppressive darkness receded, and the whispers grew faint. But then, the light began to flicker again. My heart sank as I realized that the fixture wasn't functioning properly. It was a race against time. The entity was growing stronger, its rage palpable. I could feel it in the air, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into my very bones. The basement filled with a deafening roar, and the shadows on the walls twisted and contorted, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to move with a life of their own. The light flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced around us. I could see the dark figure from before, its shape more defined and terrifying than ever. It seemed to be drawing strength from the darkness, feeding off our fear. In a frantic attempt to stabilize the light, Jack grabbed a spare bulb from our bag and replaced the faulty one. As he worked, I stood guard, trying to fend off the encroaching darkness with the flashlight. My hands were trembling, sweat pouring down my face, but I forced myself to stay focused. The entity was almost upon us now, a swirling mass of darkness and malevolence. I could feel its presence closing in, its whispers growing louder, more frenzied. My vision was swimming with the shifting shadows, and I had to fight to keep the beam of the flashlight steady. Just as I was about to give up hope, the new bulb flickered to life. The basement was bathed in a harsh, bright light, pushing back the shadows and the entity's influence. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive weight that had been pressing down on us began to lift. But the entity was not defeated. It roared in frustration, its form writhing and seething as if it were being torn apart by the light. The noise was deafening, and the floor trembled beneath our feet. I could feel a powerful force trying to pull us back into the darkness, but we held our ground, our resolve hardening as the light held strong. The confrontation was agonizingly slow, a battle of wills between us and the darkness. But as the minutes passed, the entity's strength waned. The whispers turned to cries of rage, then to silence. The shadows receded, leaving only the harsh light of the fixture. Exhausted and trembling, Jack and I stood in the basement, the weight of what had happened finally hitting us. We had survived, but the terror of that night would stay with us forever. The house was still, eerily quiet now, but the sense of danger had not entirely faded. We knew that the entity had been banished, but the experience had left us with a profound sense of unease. As we left the basement and made our way upstairs, I glanced back at the locked room. The light in the basement remained steady, casting a protective glow over us. We knew we had won this battle, but the scars of what we had faced would linger. We had come face to face with something dark and powerful, and it had changed us forever.